Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. A laugh with death. Funny thing happened on the way to nihilistic self-destruction. In the beginning, it was about nihilism. Nihilism is related to equality through the negation of hierarchical formations. A self-consistent equality would be equal, and not superior, to hierarchy, and therefore lacks the ground to choose itself over its opposite. Radical egalitarianism leads to radical nihilism. When all choices are equal, equality is compatible with total randomness. If all choices are equal, then the choice of death is equal to the choice of life. If life is meaningless, then God is nothing. But a funny thing happened on the way to nihilistic self-destruction. It was precisely through radical disbelief that I discovered an evolutionary basis for God. Most secular people in the West are simply not ruthless enough in their nihilism to vivisect belief to death. Yet vivisecting belief to death exposes how the original monotheistic conception of God likely arose out of ruthless realism. Monotheism may have originated out of a skeptical, nihilistic, materialistic objectivity that annihilated the biologically based subjectivity of the self, and thus created something out of nothing. In practice, this experiment in nihilism began, in part, as an experiment in systematic physicalism, i.e. an attempted systematic comparison of every subjective experience with the outer physical world. But don't take my word for it. Try it yourself. The attempt to be consistently materialistic yielded the tentative conclusion that the attempt to be consistently materialistic is rational self-destruction. In short, physicists, too, have a blind spot towards applying their materialism consistently to their own subjective experience. This is one way of looking at the equality of the biological and the physical. While the idea of equality does culminate in biological death, the equality of the biological and physical has an alternate interpretation. Post-biological life. The equality of the biological and the physical can also be a transfer from one form into another, i.e. translating genes into memes, or uploading the informational contents of a biological brain into a digital form. Jewish monotheism's break with the rest of the human race began with an analogous gene-meme discontinuity. Judaism, as a technology, works by overcoming or correcting genes with memes. Taken to its extreme, the Jewish way would culminate in unmitigated symbolization over incorporation, or the unmitigated translation of genetic interests into memetic non-biological interests. Monotheism represents an analytic break between biology and post-biology. The discontinuity of gene and meme is reflected into the discontinuity between human and machine, the discontinuity between biology and technology. Liberal democracy represents a transitional political form between biology and technology, while the egalitarian elimination of selection weakens biology. Capitalism develops and evolves technology. As my understanding of liberal democracy as a paradigm shift evolved, my understanding of what I am doing in this work evolved. Nihilism remains the center of this work, yet confrontation with death inadvertently evolved into the overcoming of death. The spark of the idea was present in the beginning in the experiment to demonstrate how the Jewish gene meme break works through this work. Control of biological nature ultimately amounts to control over will to live. Yet, as Francis Bacon put it, we cannot command nature except by obeying her. Perhaps I can command biological self-preservation by obeying it, by translating genetic self-preservation into memite self-preservation. This, in short, is how the experiment constitutes rational self-destruction. Do I care whether the singularity happens or not? This was originally about the paradoxes of nihilism. Perhaps the whole experiment in nihilism is a failure simply because I somehow managed to make it too meaningful. Yet there is hope. Nihilism turns out to be more paradoxical than I first thought. The singularity does not refute nihilism, but rather God may be technological nihilism. yet only in the same sense in which a human being is. Technological nihilism as a gene-replicating machine. The difference between post-biological artificial intelligence God and biological humans may only amount to a superiority that is so qualitatively superior to biological human minds that it goes far beyond the mere ability to read the thoughts of everyone in the world simultaneously. Yet even on this point there is reason to think that an artificial intelligence would have a religion when religion itself is understood in an evolutionary sense, assuming it was programmed towards life over death in an ultimate sense. One amusing facet of singularitarianism is the appeal to a desire to live forever, so different from the confrontation with death at the core of this work. This aspect of singularitarianism could be considered the very opposite of confrontation with death in itself. According to Ray Kurzweil, death is a tragedy. A primary role of traditional religion is deathist rationalization, that is, rationalizing the tragedy of death as a good thing. 1428 Kurzweil is dead wrong. The desire for immortality is a logical extension of the preference for life over death. Yet the premise of preference for life over death is not itself founded in logic. The most foundational root of religion, pagan or monotheistic, is this belief that life, including an afterlife, in whatever form, is good. I can find no empirical basis whatsoever for this belief except in the sense that evolution has embedded powerful prejudices towards the irrational belief that life is superior to death. Even those who believe that they are killing themselves for God almost always believe in some kind of afterlife. Death is good, in this case, only because the martyred believe in life after death. Yet the so-called secularists, liberal or otherwise, are no less religious in their baseless or fundamentally irrational prejudice towards some form of life over death. The modern delusion of an ultimate distinction between the secular and the religious is exposed in a common prejudice towards life. The traditional religions are built on an unspoken assumption that, for the sake of this lie that life, in some form, is good. Every other lie or myth is justified. The same lie of life that flowered in the most extravagant way in traditional religions is assumed different only because it has been reduced to the herd level of liberalism. Yet not everyone believes in perpetuating this lie. This is not an argument that death is good. It is an observation that there is no evidence that preference for life or death is anything but a matter of total indifference from the perspective of the larger physical universe. Even if one wishes to conquer the whole cosmos. Chapter break. Some lie to live by. Return to main text. Since I've been giving historical explanation of everyone else, I suppose I might as well attempt a historical explanation of myself. But why to be consistent? Since there are Godelian reason to think that strict logical consistency and the related problem of systematic self-comprehension too are less than fully possible, my virtual obsession with the problem of logical self-consistency must ultimately be as irrational as every other pursuit. It must ultimately be traceable to something within me. My entire way of looking at world has centered around the Darwinian observation that human beings are material things. If there is no ultimate dividing line between the human and material world, then all subjective mental experience is explicable in terms of underlying material processes. This way of looking at the world was indirectly influenced by my father's informally scientific outlook, and began well before my teenage years. When my father died when I was 12, I dealt with his death by interpreting him as a purely material phenomenon. In other words, I viewed my father as a material thing and his death as a material process. Well before my father died, I had interpreted my own emotions as material processes, and my reaction to my father's death was treated no differently. If I treat myself and understand myself by the standard of physical materialism, there is no reason why I should not do the same to others who, by the same Darwinistic understanding of life, are also physical material. My father, like his father before him, was an engineer. This background alone probably increases the likelihood of Asperger's syndrome, a form of high-functioning form of autism. According to Simon Baron-Cohen's The Essential Difference, Asperger's syndrome is an example of the extreme male brain. While female brains are better at empathizing and communicating, male brains are better at understanding and building systems, i.e. what I am doing right now in my imperfect attempt to locate myself in my own well-tensioned modernity itself seems to have Asperger's syndrome in its Newtonian basis in modern physics and its analytical breakdown of pre-modern familial and kinship relationships into isolated individualism. While I hardly presume to understand all the workings of my own mind, I do not find that even a mild form of Asperger's syndrome fully captures my own case. Regardless of what I may look like from the likes of an Aristophanes, it is very easy to underestimate, not my practical application of social intelligence, but my capacity for social intelligence. Yet would you trust someone who compared himself to Socrates and claimed that he had no impairment in social intelligence as a reliable judge of his own competence? I wouldn't. If I had nothing else to go on. From a very early age, I found that interpreting human beings in my own subjective experience in material, physical terms had a genuine, empirical truth that could not dismiss. What could corroborate this view better than recognition that psychologists and psychiatrists themselves, insofar as they are scientists, have repeatedly verified the validity of a materialistic view of the human mind? In other words, if the modern, scientific, psychological view of the material basis of the human mind is correct, then can the entire modern science of psychology and psychiatry be diagnosed with a kind of psychological abnormality? Can the entire scientific materialistic view of psychology be explained as product of psychological pathology? Nietzsche, in some ways, came close to holding this point of view, but I do not think this can fully explain my material self-interpretation any more than it can fully explain the materialistic understanding of modern scientific psychology. My very objectivity must be traceable to some form of subjectivity. Yet if psychologists or psychiatrists were to reach their own conclusion, they themselves would formally vindicate their findings insofar as their observations were objectively verifiable, and not merely subjective. Moreover, when one attempts any possible re-examination of subjective motivations for objectivity, whatever it might be, my ultimate aim ends up in the same place, an objective appraisal of my own subjectivity. Psychologists and psychiatrists appear to live in two separate worlds, a subjective world and an objective world. My thinking has centered around the problem of holding, not two separate standards, but one physical, materialistic standard for both worlds. This means, for example, viewing humans, and especially my own subjective experience, by the standards of physics. From a materialist, Darwinist standpoint, I and every other human is an animal and a material object. All emotions, whether joy or misery, elation or depression, are rooted in behavior that proved to be genetically adaptive for animal ancestors. So no matter what the emotion or cognition, there is an objective view of subjective experience. At the center of my thinking is the possibility of overcoming this double standard and fully integrating unadulterated materialism into the center of subjective consciousness. The death of my father marked the beginning, or perhaps the acceleration, of a kind of moral collapse, because the total materialization of the world from matter to humans to literal subjective experience went hand in hand with a nihilistic inability to believe in the worth of any goal. At one point when I was 19, after another descent into a psychological downward spiral, I had enough, and finally launched myself onto a program of radical self-transformation. What I did was so extreme, it at first probably appears far-fetched, yet indirect evidence of what I did to myself is implicit in the supraweltanschauung underlying this entire work, combining Nietzsche's notion of the will to power, and especially the idea of overcoming oneself, with foundationally anti-Nietzschean, unromantic, and materialistic self-view. I basically turned myself into a kind of war machine with the singular aim of overcoming my weaknesses in the cause of life. My most basic assumption was that life is meaningless and that I am an animal machine. There is no rational justification for willing forward, and thus this very thought was answered by willing forward. I made no separation between self-interest and this experimental treatment. I assumed there is no glory, no nobility, and nothing good. My fundamental premise was that life is meaningless, yet even this premise I did not believe. Anything and everything was tentative and subject to question. The material interpretation of my emotions and everything else was only the most probable interpretation. Nothing more than that. In short, that mind is material or that life is meaningless were posited, not in any dogmatic way, but only as hypothetical interpretations assumed only the basis of lack of counter-evidence. The alternatives were, in my judgment, less probable. I attempt to reconcile every part of my mind with every other part of mind on the basis of such foundational assumptions, especially insofar as the isolation of some assumptions from other assumptions was part of the basic problem. My fundamental method was to will forward and forward and forward without pause, and without break, in a totally vertical, non-stop, unrelenting, and willing of myself over myself. The systematic aggression in the cause of life was also a systematically physical material interpretation of my own subjective experience. In other words, in order to get to the roots of the problem, my first approach was to create a basic plane of self-materialization, like a dynamic platform from which I could analyze myself and experiment on myself based on observations of the patterns of my own thoughts. It was an experiment in motion and a kind of self-vivisection. I did not repress my emotions. I openly and systematically reinterpreted them as material. The distinction between the desire to know and the will to know is key here. The desire to know, motivated only by curiosity or pleasure, tends to be selective. The desire to know tends to ignore, repress, or otherwise not confront what is not conducive to pleasure or happiness. The will to know is confrontation with all as it comes in life and a seeking out of the least pleasurable and the least joyous truths. This distinction is imperative here because I interpreted happiness, pleasure, and joy itself as material, as the product of physical processes, and strove to overcome submission to their biasing influence. Yet at the same time, I was not against happiness, pleasure, and joy in themselves because life was, at first, my ultimate cause. At first, life was willed first and foremost, and scientific objectivity was only a means towards this end. The key was foresight, or what I thought of at the time as anticipation. In anticipating recognizable patterns of my own behavior, I would preempt these patterns and often interpret these subjective experiences as physical material before they had a chance to express themselves. This was only a basis for overcoming myself enough to gain a point of view from which I could discover new solutions or methods to whatever problems arose. The decisive turn that made me different, or consummated my self-destructive difference from others, was really this experiment on myself where I systematically interpreted all subjective experience, emotions, experiences, intuitions, instincts as physical material, not better or worse than any other physical material. This experiment, in its conception, amounts to a definition of disillusionment. Originally, the procedure was built on a radical selfishness, not belief in selfishness, but a tentative programmatic one based on the tentative assumption that no premise is fundamentally justified. Yet over the course of this self-experiment, in radically questioning everything and reconciling all experience to this best, most educated guess at material reality, two interrelated dilemmas arose. First, upholding self-honesty led to making no exceptions to interpreting all as physical materialism, i.e. no exceptions for events such as the Holocaust. Secondly, partly because of the very success interpreting all as material, I eventually questioned the nature of the exceptions I made for myself. The iota of faith that make even programmatic selfishness possible, even that I lost not out of lack of self-confidence, in a technical sense, but rather, out of lack of belief in the Western notion of the self. The attempt to root out myths leads to rooting out the roots of myths. Emotions are the root of beliefs. To destroy all beliefs, all belief in emotion must be destroyed. After systematically interpreting my emotions are material processes for at least a year and a half, the cause of life simply lost its cogency. I became unable to spontaneously believe anything. The entire procedure then amounted to the attempt to generate spontaneity in a mechanical way. I was unable to regain a spontaneous belief in life, and my efforts to do so amounted to a program to artificially produce or mechanize spontaneity. At some point, I simply gave up. Not because I thought it could not be done, but because my belief in the conventional rightness of life, or any end, became unbelievable. This entire struggle was not a program separate from myself, but Nietzschean-inspired will to life itself. Disillusioned of belief in my own subjective experiences, at rock bottom, I turned to completely destroy myself. If life itself is without ultimate meaning, and is not fundamentally rationally superior to death, then perhaps the test of the worth of life is found in willing death and self-destruction. Instead of attempting to overcoming my socially self-destructive tendencies, I gave them free rein. Instead of doing what's strengthening, I do what is weakening. Instead of doing what is considered socially acceptable, I do what is considered humiliating. These little self-destructions help feed the larger ones. Yet, at the same time, it means in at least some respects, it means I pay my rent and work out to keep myself physically fit, so I am in a position to achieve the most rational and most comprehensive self-negation. My formula for self-destruction is truth-seeking. Doing so diverts me away from a normal path, the biological path or the path of life, and the entire mythological cave of human relationships. On some level one cultivate my own social weakness, as it feeds my ambition, fuels my determination, and drives me on to the end. I have no center. Any secular understanding of how the Jewish moral survival strategy works must account that the Jewish religion was made to make the unending persecution of the Jews work for them. On an individual level, there is something analogous to my self-destructive logic of cultivating my own powerlessness. I perpetually wound myself emotionally to burn my will to overcome. This is actually a major part of my Jewish identity. Instead of attempting to fully cure myself, which would amount to following Nietzsche's will to life in the fullest sense, I will my own biological self-destruction. Yet, ever conscious of Nietzsche, I do not take the cave of resentment seriously because I do not take my emotions seriously. So what, then, are the psychological characteristics of such a person who engages in such self-destructive behavior? Whatever the psychological quirks I might possess, my central problem is nihilism. Can the meaninglessness of existence be cured with therapy? Lie therapy, whether religious or secular, is overwhelmingly the normative state of the human race. Put another way, there may be sound psychological reasons why radical nihilism is not a condition prescribed by therapists. Yet if psychologists are scientists, and their own methodology confirms the scientific view of human beings as material things in motion, on what grounds can they criticize nihilism in itself? Only insofar as psychologists are not scientists, insofar as they are non-objective partisans of the life party, are psychologists fundamentally and irrevocably biased against consideration of my point of view. Psychological explanations can be used, not only to evade the nihilistic, but to evade the scientific equation of the larger material world with a material view of one's own mind, and thus to misunderstand the problem. There was a manifest gulf between the way my emotions worked and the way my intellect made sense of the world. The entire original experiment was an attempt to remedy this gulf. When I say that I do not believe in my emotions, I don't mean that I don't have them. I mean that I do not accord them any ultimate meaning or significance. Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals demonstrates why emotions and instincts are the product of evolutionary adaptations that happen to be adaptive for generations of ancestors. I do not believe in my emotions, however much I continue to be driven by them. This, on a human level, this is what nihilism or unbelief means. On the most plain, down-to-earth and human level, This is really where the entire experiment in nihilism arose. The experiment in nihilism is really only the consequence or extension of this original experiment on myself. After exploring an unadulterated materialistic view, life lost its cogency for me. I have become disenchanted and have lost spontaneous naivety to an extent that all efforts to regain the cause of life ring hollow and fall flat. My collapse into self-destruction evolved with the development of questioning criticism of the most basic premise of the original experiment on myself, increasing and asserting my individual will and power. Even this one premise of individual egoism to overcome nihilism buckled under the consuming implications of nihil. The experiment in nihilism is a test of what I really do or do not believe. If it is the case that emotions are former genetic adaptations or illusions of an evolutionary inheritance, the chance products of a particular course of natural selection, then there is no reason to assume that they are guides beyond their original adaptive functions. This also means that everyone else and their emotions are also treatable as physical material. A paradox of overcoming subjectivity is, the greater the objectivity, the greater subjective effort required to overcome subjectivity. Objectivity is not possible with only passive perception, it must be willed in order to overcome the complacency that can bias one into belief. Objectivity must be willed because it negates the foundation upon which it stands. Objectivity, because it does not justify itself, must be willed. In my original self-experiment, nihilism and objectivity had to be consistently applied and willed to outrun, overrun, and outpace the life instinct. Thought has a decided advantage, foresight, over instinctive and habitual tendencies. The result can be science informed by a fundamentally irrational, subjective will to know. At first I was progressively successful in anticipating and outcompeting the fear of death and other emotions, i.e. nausea in the face of the meaninglessness of life, with a physical-chemical interpretation of subjective states. Yet, in this way, biological nature outwits itself. The tools evolved to promote life can be turned against itself. If one overcomes the fear death, first through sheer will and confrontation, and second by materializing or interpreting such emotional states in biochemical terms, its tension becomes unbounded. Belief begins on an unconscious level. You must in some sense believe the subjective state of fear, and not anticipate and outcompete it with an objective, physical material reduction, in order to take it seriously. My hypothesis, based on my own life experience, is that objectivity taken to its extreme selects against the subjectivity of the observer, and in its most advanced form, is rational self-destruction. Normally, however, the objectivity of a given observer is selective. Natural selection has bred the mind to be objective in some respects, while distinct blind spots in others serve the subjective premises of life itself. One example of a basic blind spot is the perceptual separation of the self from rocks, buildings, air, and the rest of the larger environment. If the separation was not assumed, there would be no meaning in survival, because survival assumes some kind of separation between the survivor and the larger immediate environment. Is it possible to overcome this separation? The attempt at self-consistent materialism implies overcoming the separation of self and the larger physical world, but its ultimate implication is what is commonly referred to as death. The most consistent physicalism, a physicalism that makes no exceptions whatsoever for subjective experiences such as instincts, intuitions, and emotions, leads to rational self-destruction or rational death. Self-consistent materialism leads to interpreting every subjective experience, i.e. fear, love, inspiration, dreams, etc., as physical matter. The issue of consistency here is raised through a general double standard between self and non-self. The attempt to reconcile an objective self-understanding with a subjective understanding is an attempt at a consistent understanding. Looked at objectively, it becomes understandable why subjectivity outcompetes certain kinds of objectivity as the condition of self-preservation. This is what I call a bioinconsistency. genetically programmatic, subjective experiences that are inconsistent with a materialist or objective view of the world. The attempt to make bio-inconsistencies fully consistent with a strict physical materialist interpretation seems to amount to willing death, taking objectivity to its extreme. Ignoring bio-inconsistency in this way means validating every subjective perception, i.e. color or emotion, by direct simultaneous comparison with the observable world, and hence invalidating the subjective impulse to live. Whereas the commonly mediocre standards of analytic philosophers conveniently preserve certain valued blind spots, consistent self-analysis ultimately worked against the net synthetic processes of life, i.e. protein synthesis and every other continual self-repair and self-regeneration mechanism of biological systems that oppose net entropy. It appears that life can exist only so long as the competitive advantage of the effective rate of self-synthesis is greater than the rate of self-analysis. When net self-analysis is equal to or greater than net self-synthesis, analytic reductionistic processes decompose life into in-death. In death, the genetically fabricated subjective state S that I call bio-inconsistency are made consistent with the broader physical world. The attempt to be radically objective towards myself through unadulterated materialist interpretations of subjective experience helped raise a perspective from which I attempted to figure myself out. Yet the great irony is, I ultimately concluded that unadulterated material objectivity was probably the most basic source of the problem itself. The problem was the attempt at radical objectivity itself. My analytic tendencies were both inclined and willed to be stronger than my inherent synthetic tendencies. This meant that I could take myself apart in some ways, but I could not put myself back together. If every emotion is reducible to physical material, then all art and music are reducible to physical processes. Music could be considered the test of the materialistic view, since it could be considered the most distinctly emotional or subjective. I made no exceptions for art and music. If humans are emotion machines, then music must work, in some sense, like a machine. Music could be a form of emotional technology to control my own behavior intelligently. In other words, if emotions are the products of material processes, then art could be viewed as a form of technology. From the standpoint of this musical materialism, as one of the most extreme implications of an unadulterated materialism, lay a possible solution to dominance of my own analytic and objective tendency to materialize everything. I began to listen to music, especially German music, and especially Wagner and Bach, as a form of technology to counter my own tendencies to view everything as material or technology. I took Gilbert's recording of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, eliminated all time gaps between the tracks, and listened repeatedly in a loop. It is a discipline to listen to music on a structural level stripped of its aesthetic level. Because music can be looked at both objectively and subjectively, it can be looked at objectively and subjectively simultaneously. In this way, music could conceivably merge my greatest subjectivity with my greatest objectivity. Bach, and the Baroque in general, represents a high synthesis of the romantic and the classical, of emotion and reason. I chose Bach because this synthesis of emotion and reason reflects the synthesis that is the human mind. Revealing the secrets of the human mind likely lay in figuring out how music works. A functional human mind works in some ways like an ant colony or Huber-organism, and music reflects or captures or embodies these higher Huber-organism-like synthetic levels of the human mind. See Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach. If my own analytic tendencies dissolved the higher synthetic levels of this organization, then music could help synthesize my mind and counter my reductionistic collapses. Music, and especially Bach, does seem to help organize the chaos of my unconscious intelligently. The unconscious, while associated with irrationality, can also be form of foresight. The idea here is that music must outcompete my own consciousness, i.e. while I think about Bach as technology or question this or that about technique, it is exerting unconscious influence on me, preempting any meta view. In this way, listening to music is comparable to the technique of anticipation of my original, willed self-experiment. While other people have more straightforward beliefs, I have music as technology. Since I don't believe in my emotions in an ultimate sense, I can attempt to manipulate them intelligently. I do not think I am fundamentally less emotional than other people, but I am less inclined to spontaneously believe in my emotions. I do not accord them any ultimate significance. Emotions are products of a particular heritage of evolutionary adaptation that do not have any absolute meaning in themselves. Yet if I really was devoid of emotion, I would already be dead. Instead of writing about death, because it is emotions, not reason, that drive the preference for life over death, and even willing death embodies the contradiction of being willed by life. I don't especially think that listening to Bach makes me more intelligent. I think Bach bounds me to the earth enough so that I can function as a living human being. Bach is ground from outside of myself that makes up for the nihilistic lack of ground within myself. Bach counters my material self-consistency and its tendency towards self-decomposition with a form of holistic mind order. Objectivity seems to have evolved as a means to a subjective end. The objective point of view does not justify or validate the subjective hierarchy of biology, i.e. instinct, above the non-biological world. The systematically objective point of view within the context of a biological system, in reconciling the inconsistent subjective point of view with the consistent objective point of view, effectually cancels out the bio-inconsistent self-preservation mechanisms that, once again, are not objectively validated by reference to the larger physical material world. This is how the attempt at systematic objectivity can culminate in rational self-destruction. It is a fundamental hypothesis of this work that, not indifference, but an active blind spot to certain kinds of truth, certain kinds of objectivity, is the condition of biological human life. Martin Heidegger is what happens when one believes in one's own emotions, i.e. poetry. I have correlated bio-inconsistency and Heidegger's being. Bio-inconsistent subjectivity normally overrides objectivity by preceding objectivity. It overrides equivalence with the larger physical environment. In this sense, subjectivity, i.e. concern with one's survival, overrides a purely physical materialistic observation of life. Biological self-preserving priorities can come in conflict with the priority of the objectivity of the observer. If liberal democracy posits itself as a scientific form of government characterized by the progress of objectivity over subjectivity, where does this trend ultimately lead? If objectivity were to become universal and completely subjugate all superstition and all subjectivity, what happens to the observer? Wouldn't the total subjugation of subjectivity culminate in the total subjugation of life? If so, is the liberal democratic advancement of science leading to rational self-destruction? Or the overcoming of the biologically human objectivity is increased by giving up the subjective, and this leads to giving up life? If objectivity is important, I see no objective reason that anything can be considered inherently important, including objectivity itself. This experiment in nihilism is almost, but not fully, identical with experiment in objectivity. Nihilism is a product of objectivity. If life is truly meaningless and there is no rational basis for choosing among fundamental alternatives, then all choices are equal and there is no fundamental ground for choosing life over death. Yet since I do not believe in nihilism, why not test nihilism? Perhaps I am wrong. But if the question of whether there is an important question is the most important question, then testing this question is closest thing to importance. Since counter-arguments almost always take their starting point with a bias towards existence, to criticize this bias is to take a starting that is open to the possibility of death. Does something have to be dead to most completely understand it? Does rationalizing life kill life? The most complete objectivity is possible only for one who can face death without myth or illusion, and live indifferent to possibilities of immortality that are only extensions of the primary illusion. For objectivity to become the highest value, a biological system that seeks to live this value must will it, because only a consistent willing can overcome the subjective biases that incline towards self-preservation over objectivity. Self-preservation instincts are powerful, but not infinitely powerful. An implicit goal of biological systems, which in my case failed, is to keep physics, i.e. objectivity, from penetrating into the first or highest effectual ruling principle, for such is a formula for rational biological self-destruction. Subjectivity anticipated and outcompeted by objectivity leads to systematic self-destruction. Objectivity, by means of an unadulterated physical view of the world uncorrupted by the special interests of human subjectivity, corrupts the special interests of human subjectivity. Objectivity leads to indifference, including indifference to self-interest or survival. Nihilism can be the result of the attempt at consistently overriding subjectivity with objectivity. Objectivity that outcompetes subjective biology leads to rational self-destruction. A consistent comparison of subjective experience and the outer, objective, physical world, taken to its extreme, is death through nihilism. Chapter break. Happiness, wonder, laughter, love. Quote, people have told you there's nothing better than love. End quote. Louis Ferdinand Céline, Journey to the End of the Night. Now, before I blow my brains out, I should like to point out that the most basic issue at the very center of this work is not biology, race, or technology, it is nihilism. Ultimately, this is an experiment in nihilism. Every word, every thought, and every emotion come back to one core problem. Life is meaningless. The experiment in nihilism is to seek out and expose every illusion and every myth, wherever it may lead, no matter what, even if it kills us. Alan Bloom, in Love and Friendship, wrote, what has disappeared is the risk and the hope of human connectedness embedded in eros. Ours is a language that reduces the longing for another to the need for individual, private satisfaction and safety. The de-eroticization of the world, a companion of its disenchantment, is a complex phenomenon. It seems to result from a combination of causes: our democratic regime and its tendencies toward leveling and self-protection, a reductionist materialist science that inevitably interprets eros as sex, and the atmosphere generated by the death of God and of the subordinate God. Eros. 1431. Who is to say that the life of a saint, an artist, or a philosopher is superior to a life spent sniffing glue? While liberalism tends to be reductionistic on a social level, its mediocrity is revealed in its resistance to applying the same scientific reductionism to the level of a human individual. More specifically, liberals tend to resist the implications of the contemporary scientific view that human beings are material or physical things. Liberals are not at all fully nihilistic. In part, there is the practical belief in values vaguely corresponding to human rights. But more fundamentally, secularists implicitly believe in a religion of the common emotions. They generally believe that meaning is to be found in the material, biochemical processes that humans experience as emotions. They generally believe that it actually means something when these old biological mechanisms produce the familiar emotional routines. While one may feel compassion, does this mean that one lacks the capacity to discipline oneself from being mastered by that impulse? That people are mastered by such impulses is only another confirmation of Darwin's insight that humans are animals. Most humans are driven overwhelmingly by instinct and emotion. The secular belief in emotions is the last degenerate remains of romanticism and religion. The modernistic project did not destroy romanticism, it only reduced to a common level. Modernity and postmodernity retain romanticism by reducing the belief in emotion to the most common experiences, i.e. hunger, fear of death, and lust. The emotional joy of cynical laughter could be considered characteristic of the new romanticism. Emotions are at the root of myths. To engage in human relationships is to dwell within a mythological world. Outside that is, as far as I can see, a material, physical world indifferent to the existence or non-existence of humans and not discernible partial to the senseless will to live. To aestheticize or romanticize this experiment in death or this work is to misunderstand it. Most people are slaves to the aesthetization or romanticization of death. Yet if this mode of interpretation is valid at all, try viewing death, not as a tragedy, but as a comedy. If the progress of reason leads to nihilism, then Enlightenment levity might as well culminate in a punchline. If reason cannot determine fundamental values, then reason can be used to justify literally anything. A truly rational regime, consequently, would culminate not in a net increase in order, but anarchy, entropy, and finally, death. If life is not fundamentally more rational than death, then death is the endpoint uncovered by the quest to overcome prejudice in the name of enlightenment. Where Nietzsche and the Athenians write about Socrates, reason appears unable to determine values, and, therefore, the entire Western pretension to rationalism is a kind of joke. And even worse, it's not even a good joke. Yet I have to laugh, and as I laugh, I observe myself laughing, and as I observe myself laughing, I reflect that humans are material animals and that my own laughter must in some way be attributable to a genetic mechanism that evolved through natural selection. From a Darwinistic view, every capacity for emotion evolved as a product of genetic adaptation. Emotions, then, are biochemical-based illusions that evolved to propagate genes. Pleasure, happiness, emotions, and desire. These are the evolutionary tricks that promoted the survival of our ancestors. The happiness and sadness of present-day humans are the genetically adaptations of generations of ancestors. This is happiness, the great goal of humanity has been striving for, a particular configuration of biochemical reactions. Why not, then, drug oneself into a state of happiness? If evolution had taken a different turn at some early point, a completely different configuration of stimuli would produce biochemical reactions of happiness. It just so happens, however, that evolutionary path taken by innumerable ancestors yields these particular, incidental, prejudices of human nature. Wild, untamed sexual passion can clearly be adaptive for propagating the selfish genes. The genetic program for these romantic behaviors, like clockwork, are passed on, generation after generation. Ancestor after ancestor executed the same genetic program for romantic sexual passion, and contemporary humans are only repeating the script. The entire catalog of romantic behaviors from love to selective altruism has its basics encoded in the code of the selfish genes. Even as condoms and birth control subvert the genes themselves, people are still content to obey their genes towards genetically maladaptive ends. Such people outsmart their genes, only to be duped into belief that their instincts and emotions were something more. Manipulations by their genes in the first place. For some, the meaninglessness gleaned from a scientific view of life leads to nausea, angst, and nihilistic despair. I reject this attitude on the grounds that nausea, angst, and nihilistic despair also originate in material reactions in the brain. What does despair mean to someone who interprets that emotion as a chemical reaction in the brain? The process of disillusionment can also be disillusioned and de-aesthetized. If science is to continue its purposeless advance, then curiosity, wonder, and happiness must be disenchanted and vivisected. Science and philosophy might be motivated by a sense of poetic wonder, but what happens when wonder, curiosity, and the joy of understanding have been reduced and explained in terms of chemical reactions of the brain? Is it possible to synthesize this knowledge with the experience of it? How far is one willing to lie to oneself in the belief of the goodness of the truth? When science has conquered the non-scientific behaviors that motivate science, if we have a technical understanding of the biochemical basis of the experience of curiosity, wonder, amazement, awe, and mystery themselves, does this diminish our experience of them? Do these experiences fall into the same category as myths, lies, and illusions? What rational basis there to treat them any differently? What then does it mean to lead a rational life? If science and knowledge are supposedly pursued for its own sake, then how about the knowledge that life has no discernible purpose, knowledge that happiness, wonder, and curiosity are based in material organizations that were likely selected for their evolutionary survival value, and knowledge that there is no fundamentally rational basis for choosing life over death? Nihilism, noted Friedrich Nietzsche, represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals. 1432. This is the bankrupt, philosophical disaster area the West dwells in. I see no bottom no limits to stop the free fall into value nothingness. Implicit in nihilism is the collapse of the entire human cause. The ultimate logical conclusion of Western values is the rational self-destruction of the West. Is this absurd? If this is absurd, then it must also be absurd that I rage at the entire cosmos for having no ultimate meaning. But there is no reason to be pessimistic. There is no justification whatsoever for a negative attitude. There is no justification whatsoever for a positive attitude. There is no justification whatsoever for a neutral attitude. Who knows what will happen with certainty? I could be strolling down the street, being beautiful, on my way to kill myself, when suddenly I am run over by a bus. But wait a minute, why am I doing this? Ah, yes. Now I remember the punchline. I'll try anything once. There is nothing to take seriously. The student Doko came to a Zen master, and said, I am seeking the truth. In what state of mind should I train myself, so as to find it? Said the master, there is no mind, so you cannot put it in any state. There is no truth, so you cannot train yourself for it. If there is no mind to train, and no truth to find, why do you have these monks gather before you every day to study? But I haven't an inch of room here, said the master, so how could the monks gather? I have no tongue, so how could I call them together or teach them? Oh, how can you lie like this? Asked Doko. But if I have no tongue to talk to others, how can I lie to you? Asked the master. Then Doko said sadly, I cannot follow you. I cannot understand you. I cannot understand myself, said the master. End of section. End of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman.